Okay, hello all. Today we're going to move on to another question in the management accounting section of the course, and it's called overhead apportionment. So the question itself is comes up in as part of a question 8. Sometimes it's part A or part B of a question 8. Sometimes it's an entire question 8 in the exam paper. So the name of the question is overhead apportionment, and there are usually several parts to it. There can be slightly different the parts. It's not a uniform type of way that it comes up every year, and we'll discuss that later when we get back into the class. But for now, we're just going to calculate on the first part, which says calculate the overhead to be absorbed by each department, stating clearly the basis of apportionment used. So to give you a quick rundown on the first part only, really not on the entire question, because that would take a longer conversation and better one that we all have when we're all sitting down together. But the idea of the calculating the overhead to be absorbed by each department and apportioning that overhead is that if you can imagine that you have a factory where there are several different departments, and if we take just as a simpler example, we say there are just two departments. It's a manufacturing factory, and they manufacture some furniture, and in the two departments, one of the departments they cut the wood to make the timber furniture, and in the second department they fit all the pieces of timber together and they do the gluing and the polishing and all that kind of stuff. So we have the, if you like, the cutting and the fitting department. Well, the idea is that each of these departments has costs associated with the work that they do in that department. So it's easy to separate out some of those costs. Like, for instance, if there's 3 employees working in one of the departments and 4 employees working in the other department, then the wages of the 3 employees in the cutting department, for instance, those wages are a cost or an overhead associated with that department. And in the other department, which has 4 employees, the wages of those 4 employees is easily associated as a cost or an overhead associated with that second department. However, where you run into issues, if you really want to know how much a department is costing you, is when you have bills that come in the door, for instance, like your electricity bill. Well, a factory or a business or building, I suppose, normally only has one electricity bill comes in. So how do you know how much electricity was used by one department as opposed to another? Or, for instance, if you have a team of cleaners who comes in and cleans all of the factory every night after all of the people who are working there are gone home, how much of that cleaning bill really should be associated with the cutting department? How much of that cleaning bill should be associated with the fitting department? So this is where this question, I suppose, part 1 of this question, tries to answer those questions. It says it's apportioning. Apportioning means like splitting up, like dividing up the costs, a certain amount, a certain portion to one department and another portion to another department. Okay, so that's the way what we're going to be doing. I'm just going to show you over here. I've written out the way we're going to lay out the question is on the basis of kind of a grid with several columns. So these are all the columns 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 for this, because we'll always have this overhead, which is just describing the name of the cost, if you like. An overhead is like a cost or an expense. The basis, that's the basis we talk about, is the way in which we've decided to split up that cost. How do we base our decision to split up that cost? We'll talk about that more in a second. The total amount of the cost in this column, and then how much each of these departments is responsible from that total cost. Okay, and we look at this question we're going to look at today. Actually, I should have said this from the very start. It's the 2007 question that you all should have a sheet for. Okay, so if we look at, I suppose, the description of the question, first of all, it says Nevis Limited has 2 production departments and 2 ancillary service departments, A and B. So we're going to consider this, for all intents and purposes, that it has 4 departments that you want to split up the costs amongst. Okay, the following are the expected overhead costs for the next period. So these are the name of the costs. This is the total amount of the cost. So, for instance, depreciation of equipment, for the next period. I suppose it could be a year, it could be a month, whatever it is. €16,000. Depreciation of the buildings, 20,000. Heating the building, 9,600. Cleaning the building, 2,000. Factory canteen, running the canteen, 10,800 it costs. Okay, and then it gives you some information about the actual departments. So here we go. There's a column each for each of the 4 departments. It tells you volume in cubic meters. So this the volume of the department. So that's a certain size measurement, if you like. The floor area in square meters. So this is area and that's volume. We know from our maths of each of those departments. The number of employees working in each department. The book value of the equipment used in each department. And lastly, the machine hours in 2 of the departments, not in the service departments, because they don't have in these service departments, that might be like a HR department or an administration department, and they don't have these heavy machinery working, I suppose, all day long, whereas, in the service department, it might just be photocopiers and phones and that type of thing, and it wouldn't come into this equation. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. First of all, we're going to write down each of the overheads or the costs and the total amount of that cost for the period, which is probably either like a year or a month or a quarter of a year or something like that. Okay, so writing that over here, because we're conscious of time, we're going to maybe abbreviate a little bit, but not too much. So depreciation of equipment. Okay. Depreciation, buildings, and we'll just say heating, cleaning, canteen. Okay, skip the basis for a second and we'll go straight to the total. So the totals for each of them, again, we're just copying these straight over: 16,000, 20,000, 9,600. So 16,000, 20,000, 9,600, 2,000, 10,800. Okay, so after this, I think the next thing that you should decide is on the basis of apportionment. So how are you going to decide to split up those costs? So, for instance, and I suppose this would be a great exercise to do in class if we were all together, but since we're not, I'm just going to give you the answer and talk through the reasons for the answer. If we start with the canteen, I guess this is how much it costs to run the canteen. But who uses the canteen in a factory or in any kind of employment? It's the employees, isn't it, that use the canteen. So if there are more employees in Department 1 than in Department 2, then really Department 1 should be responsible for paying more of the bill for the canteen than Department 2. Okay, so the more employees a department has, the more of this 10,800 should be apportioned to that department. So if we look down through our question again, and over here, this additional information it gives us about the production, the departments rather, that's going to be where we pull our basis from. And the first one that we pulled from the bottom there, canteen, was number of employees. It gives you a number of employees for each of these departments. And that is how I'm going to put just employees. That's how we're going to base our dividing up of this 10,800 between the departments. We're going to base it on the number of employees. Okay. Now, what you might say is, it's going to be hard to think about these, but we'll discuss these few here, and there might be maybe one or two extra you come across in other questions, but essentially then after that it's always the same reasoning. Like canteen will always be employees. As we go through them, the depreciation of buildings, for instance, will always be the size of the building that you're using. The depreciation of equipment will always be book value of equipment, and we'll explain why, but you don't have to worry about, I suppose, having to rethink about this every time you do this question, because there's a limited number of bases out there within which, and a limited number of expenses that you're going to be asked to divide up. Okay, so to go through, I suppose, a few more of them then. The depreciation of equipment, I said already, was book value of equipment. And that should be the basis of depreciation, shouldn't it? Because that's how we calculate the depreciation normally on equipment, isn't it? We take whatever the book value was, or the cost sometimes, and then we calculate a percentage of that cost, and that turns out to be the depreciation then for the period. Isn't that right? So book value. Okay, next one is depreciation of buildings. Now, you might say it would be the same for buildings. It would be cost or book value of the buildings will determine how much, how we divide up the depreciation of the buildings amongst department 1, 2, and A and B. But perhaps, perhaps some of these departments are in the same building. So you need something a bit more forensic than that to divide it up. And how we do it is we look at the floor area in square meters that these departments are taking up within the building. Okay, so if they're taking up more of a floor area of the building, in other words, if they're occupying more of the building, then they should be paying more of the depreciation, or responsible for more of the depreciation of the building. Okay, so floor area is that one. Next one is heating, and heating, where is it? We are going to be, again, if we look down through this, volume, floor area, number of employees, book value, machine hours. I think just looking at that there, you could certainly narrow it down to thinking, well, it should definitely be volume or floor area. It has to do with the size of the building that you're taking, or the size of the space in the building that you're taking up, should determine how much you're paying for the heating. Isn't that right? And when it comes to heating, I suppose we're not just heating the ground, as it were. We're heating a space, so we're thinking in 3 dimensions rather than 2. So we're going to use the volume that the production department takes up rather than the floor area. But I would say, in saying that though, if I was doing this question and there was heating was one of the expenses to be split up, and there was no there was no volume, but there was only floor area, then I would use floor area as the base. However, when volume is an option, then you should always use volume as the base for splitting up a heating expense. Okay, so volume, what do we call it? Just volume is all they say, so we'll stick with that. Okay, and lastly, cleaning then. Again, I would say for the reason we've discussed, I suppose, already, that the more of the building that you're using, then that's more work for the people who are cleaning. So the expense of cleaning the building should be the bigger the floor area that you occupy, the more the cleaning bill that you should be paying. So I would say floor area is a good base again. For cleaning. Okay, and we'll continue this in the next video.